Oh, welcome back to Com 100. Today, if you can't tell, we're going to go into a little bit more detail into metaphor. Metaphor is one of the single most important tools in all of rhetoric, and I would really say all of communication, because of what it allows us to do. Metaphor allows us to make comparisons between two unlike things to expand how we think about both. And that is basically a superpower. We looked at some metaphors and some specifically pointed appeals when we looked at MLK's I Have a Dream speech. We didn't really break down the metaphors and how they work. Technically, we just sort of noted that they were there. And so, to get a better idea of why a metaphor is so valuable and why we should laud good metaphors, uh, let's take a look inside, basically. Take a sneak peek inside metaphor. One of the big and initial things that we want to know is that similes are metaphor. They're just sort of like special metaphor that tell you they are metaphors. And we'll get into that as we move forward. Like I said, a metaphor definitionally is a comparison of two seemingly unlike things. Two seemingly unlike things. Um, you could use a metaphor. It's like he bounced like a basketball, which is fine as long as the thing that you're describing doesn't isn't similar to a basketball. So if you're talking about someone's leg, like they're nervously bouncing their leg, you could say he was dribbling his leg like a basketball or something like that. And that would be a good metaphor. That's fine, right? It's interesting. But if you said I was bouncing the bouncy ball like a basketball, that's while it might be accurate to what you're trying to describe, it doesn't extend our knowledge of either thing that you're describing. We sort of get that they're similar, and because we understand that they're similar, that's not a particularly good or clever use of metaphor. And so it's a comparison of two seemingly unlike things. And we'll get into more detail when we talk about the tenor and the vehicle. Similes are special metaphors. They're all metaphors. They function the same way. It's just they tell you they are metaphors by using the words like or as. So if I were to say that um, Johnny is as strong as an ox, it's clearly a simile because I'm using like and as, right? Is as strong as an ox. So I'm basically telling you that I'm making the metaphor. I'm describing um, the metaphor and the relationship I want you to take from it, right? I'm basically telling you oxes or oxen are strong. Um, this person, Johnny, is also strong and is strong such that his strength is comparable to an oxen, right? And then we can know when to take that literally or not, and we do a good job of trying to parse out when people are trying to describe something accurately and when they're being symbolic. We can usually tell it's sort of a quirk of how we learn about language. But a metaphor that's not a simile doesn't need that like or as. If, say, this Johnny person I've made up does something strong, like it lifts something very large, you could just say Johnny is an ox. And that's not a simile because we're not saying like or as. But we're still comparing Johnny's strength to the oxen's strength. It's just context is more important there because we're not describing it as thoroughly as a simile would. So similes really break down the comparisons that they make, whereas metaphors that are not similes, just regular metaphors, just sort of tell you something is something, whereas a simile says something is like something else or has done something as something else would have done it. Metaphor, moving down, have two parts, right? They have a tenor and they have a vehicle. The way that I remember that is thinking of Pavarotti, the great tenor opera singer, in a Cadillac, which is a vehicle. So Pavarotti in a Cadillac, that's a metaphor. A tenor in a vehicle. The tenor is the subject of the metaphor. And by subject, I mean that grammatically. So tenor is the thing that you are describing. It's the thing that you're making the comparison to. And an example, the metaphor we were talking about previously with this sort of made up Johnny character and being strong, the tenor in that metaphor, Johnny is an ox, or in the simile, because it's the same organization for similes, Johnny is as strong as an ox. The tenor there is Johnny. That is the subject. Okay? And the vehicle is the object with the borrowed quality that is applied to the tenor. So the vehicle in the simile, Johnny is as strong as an ox, is the ox, right? The vehicle is the object that we're borrowing a quality from to make the comparison. And the quality that we're talking about is strength. So the tenor, Johnny, the vehicle, the oxen, and the reason we call it a vehicle is because it basically serves to make a point about Johnny's strength, right? And this is important to be able to tell because then you know what you're talking about. And when you can break down a metaphor, when you can understand these symbolic comparisons, it really opens the door for you to understand pretty complex uses of language. Um, Poetry is full of metaphor, right? Completely full, chock full of metaphor. And if you understand how a metaphor works, then poems that you might have thought were, oh, that poem's really weird, I don't get what's going on there. Well, now you're equipped to sort of go back and look at them and say, oh, okay, it's comparing these things um, versus, telling me the sky is stainless steel, right? It's not being literal, it's making a comparison there. And if the sky is the tenor and a stainless steel is the vehicle, then what quality are they being shared? And perhaps that's what that image is about. Or in William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying, right? The famous chapter from the young boy's perspective, my mother is a fish. A metaphor, right? And if we break it down into tenor and vehicle, and if you've read that novel, then you can maybe understand a little bit more about what's going on there in the character's mind and what's being described. So on the bottom of the slide, you'll see that metaphors have three big advantages. And by that, I mean advantages over just speaking plainly or trying to speak literally. And they're advantages that we should take advantage of when we're trying to communicate, and especially when we are crafting a message. You should take advantage of parts of speech that help you out. And metaphors absolutely can help you out a lot. The first reason is because they allow us to get accurate in a way that speaking literally simply does not allow. We can technically explain something's sharpness, right? If a knife is very sharp, we could explain that it's been ground to a certain grit. We could talk about how many microns thick the blade is. Or, we could say that it goes through wood like a hot knife through butter, right? We can use that simile and describe in a way that gets at the heart of what we're trying to communicate much better and much broader than just simply describing it in a technical measure in a way that's not as symbolic. So it allows us to sort of get at the core of how we want people to understand something. And that allows us greater accuracy when we're describing things and how we want people to understand them. From a rhetorical perspective, that's important because when we're trying to persuade people, when we're trying to impact their attitude, behavior, or belief, it's important to be doing that in a way that we're in control of. the message, that we're in control of the message. You never want to be in control of the person that you're trying to persuade, because then that's not persuasion, that's manipulation. But when you're in control of your message, when you know and have a better idea of how it's going to be interpreted, that allows you to be far more persuasive, which is why audience analysis is so important, right? Because then you know where your audience is, what they understand, and you are able then to use metaphors that they would understand to describe things that maybe they don't. And you can make those connections. So it allows for a sense of accuracy in thinking and a sense of accuracy in the sense that you give them of something, right? So pay attention to the tenors that you're describing, and you can find interesting vehicles to get more accurate understanding of how you want them to understand the tenor that you're talking about. But this also leads us to the second of the three big advantages, and that's variety. Especially when you're talking about something and you have to mention it a lot, right? When something is the subject of a speech or the subject of an artifact, it's going to be brought up a lot. Think of papers that you've written before, whether they're about speeches or historical figures or a piece of literature. Chances are you get a little repetitive. That's just the nature, first, of academic writing in general, but also when we're doing a deep dive, an analysis of something, we bring up certain parts again and again. And that can get tedious for you as the writer and certainly for your audience. And so using metaphor, using simile allows us to have variety in how we refer to something and allows us to create a sense, as I mentioned before, around that thing that can help us. So here's where we can go back to King and even further appreciate the I Have a Dream speech, particularly with the metaphors surrounding money and banks and lending. It's a way of using variety to describe the plight for justice, right? In ways that people can understand if they haven't experienced oppression themselves. And also, it gives you a way to talk about it that provides variety and gives you way more room as a rhetor or as a communicator. And King systematically has several sets of metaphor that he does that with. Of course, like I mentioned, the financial metaphors, but when he mentions very similar things, but in nature metaphors. And so that's just even more variety. And within those two sort of big genres of metaphor, there's a lot of different specific examples. So there's a lot of variety there. So you can have a message, but tell it and work around it in a lot of different ways to make sure your audience understands it. And because of the accuracy that it provides, you have control over the sense that they're getting from it. So when you're communicating metaphor, when you think through it and when you plan it, is extremely powerful because of the accuracy, but also the variety that it gives you. And the last big advantage is purpose. It gives you a way to describe things such that they are intentionally described, and you can intentionally connect things to make even greater points, almost to the point where the arguments you can make are subconscious arguments. So think back to King's appeal to nature. He talks about mountains and valleys, and on its face, right, that metaphor, if we don't want to do too deep of a dive, it makes sense, right? If justice is a mountain, a peak, it's a high, it's something we aspire to, but something you got to climb to get towards, while injustice is a valley. It's sort of dark. You can get stuck in it. And that makes sense on its face that way. But if we look deeper to the purpose, by using natural metaphors, light and dark, peaks and valleys, he's also connecting the arguments that he's making about justice, as we mentioned before, to the natural world. So he's making equality and justice seem like something natural. So through the vehicles that King was picking, he's making another argument for how we should understand what justice is. And that gives an even deeper layer of purpose and meaning to a metaphor. So you have the opportunity when you're using metaphor, you have the ability to fine tune your message so much. And it doesn't have to be a high stakes situation, right? Even if you're just trying to describe your day to someone, like your friend asks you, how was your day? And maybe you were tired, right? Maybe you were just exhausted. Then you could use a metaphor. It's saying, like, man, today's been so long. I woke up as tired as a marathon runner, right? As tired as. It's a simile. Now, I'm not saying that's particularly good, but it sets the tone, right? And you can then start to describe things. So metaphor and simile are basic in one sense, in that they're so prevalent, they're everywhere, but also highly complex in what you can do with them. And if you appreciate language, if you appreciate messages, um, then literally just go look up any poem and read it for metaphors and try to understand the relationship between the tenor and the vehicle. And the ideas that you get from there are just so rich and deep. I want to basically turn you into a big nerd for language, not only because that's an important part of rhetoric and it's important part of meaning and determining what something means and how it creates meaning in its construction, but also because it makes your life so much more rich when you can make all these connections. It's a very similar process to just sort of learning in general, right? In that we recognize the relationship between things and it gives us new insight into both. Think of, and I might have mentioned this before, but think of the way that toddlers learn concepts, right? If something's got 4 legs and a tail, oh, that's a dog. But when they see a cow, it's got 4 legs and a tail, dog. And then you have to explain to them, no, that's something different, right? It's bigger, it's got a different purpose. We don't keep them as pets, although we could. They're giant, adorable creatures. But and then they sort of understand that, well, while similar, they're also different. Metaphor allows us to do the same thing, but in a much um, quicker, more dynamic way. It's sort of a much more condensed package of meaning and the relationships between ideas. So, metaphor is extremely valuable. And as we move on to next week, we will continue to look at some metaphor, but then we will talk about some irony, because irony is also incredibly important, especially when we sort of get uh, into sarcasm and being disingenuous. That happens a lot. And to understand the ways in which we do that gives glimpses into society in the way that only rhetoric can. So that's metaphor, and we will continue next week.